A lot of what we're talking about today is to do with interaction. It's not specifically to do with motor movements in the individual, it's how somebody interacts in concert with somebody else, like that mother and baby. No more fiendish punishment could be devised were such a thing physically possible, then one should be turned loose in society and remain absolutely unnoticed. That's what William James said in 1890. It's quite easy for us to tell whether somebody's social. Just thought I'd start with this very briefly, assuming it works. This is one of the Frith-Happy animations. And these are being used to look at how well somebody can recognize whether something is social or not. And this is just one of 16 little vignettes, which are very similar to some earlier ones from the mid-last century, where you're trying to decide what's going on. And obviously what you're seeing is some triangles. Now, I was surprised how telling this is when you do it with slightly more able children on the spectrum. A lot of the kids that I used this with thought that these two triangles were being highly aggressive. I doubt many people here made that interpretation of what's going on. But that's just to show you some of the sort of simple techniques that are in development just now for looking at early understanding of social functioning. But it relies on being able to verbalise what you can see. I put this up because I didn't know Filippo was going to mention the Teitelbaum studies. This is just a still from their 1998 paper in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. It's a wee girl of 8.5 months who doesn't show any parachute reaction when she starts to topple. She just falls sideways and bangs her head. But a lot of their early videos of motor development in the early months of life showed differences in the children who went on to develop ASD compared to what they expected from the Eschwol-Wachmann series that they were comparing against. Now, what we've heard about today is a work in progress. We're not talking about things that off the shelf are ready to use in clinical everyday practice. So go back to what was mentioned earlier on about RDoC. RDoC, which are the NIMH new criteria that are being used for assessing anybody going into research in the States on autism, have a motor component to them. There are a number of papers on that on the web. There's also a set of motor activities that are standardised from 3 to 85. So they can be used right through the age range, and they would work with adults in Manchester to look at motor abnormality compared to predicted normative data. So we don't have all the answers yet. You have to go wholeheartedly into anything in order to achieve anything worth having. There are only two options: make progress or make excuses. ASD is a concept that's overstretched its utility in clinical practice. It's gone from being seen as a rare Cinderella diagnosis when I was training, affecting maybe 1 in 2,500 people in the general population. But today it's seen as the most costly diagnosis in health practice in the UK. ASD affects more than 1 in 100 of the population, and the annual UK public sector cost is over 42 billion a year. That is huge. The high costs are due to the escalating cost of care, coupled with insistence on an evidence-based approach to practice with no adequate evidence base to draw on. Now, why do I say we lack an adequate evidence base? Several reasons. We lack good, well-validated assessment tools with ASD data. Most of the assessments that we use are standardised on other populations, don't have anything on ASD, and we're hearing today about a lot of specific differences within that population. Now, most of the information we have on autism is about 4 to 7-year-old boys of normal intelligence who are verbal and don't have any medical comorbidities. They're not the ones we want to reach in terms of clinical intervention. They're the ones who tend to do reasonably well anyway, and they're not the people that we try and help. Now, we regularly change the criteria and need to update our research to reflect this. America's just gone from DSM-4 TR to DSM-5 with a radical increase in numbers, largely because for the first time you can have ADHD and autism. Now that's 40% increase in the numbers in the States. But no previous research on the use of methylphenidate or any other ADHD treatments in the ASD population, because they didn't exist until 2 years ago. Ping, they've all suddenly appeared. RDoC has a different set of criteria again. We don't know how well they match. ICD-11 may well not match onto either of them. And the Americans have just funded $750 million worth of research that's RDoC based. We're going to have a massive research, but no way of linking it into clinical practice. Now, in order for RDoC to start off, and for the IACC to start funding more systematic studies, they did 2 comparative evaluation reviews of the literature. Now, these were published in 2011 and 2012. There's a more recent one on the IBI, which is quite positive. But up until that point, they identified over 9,000 studies that NIMH had funded. And when you winnow them down by do they meet methodological criteria, the sample size is big enough, do they have good controls, etc., you get down to a wonderful total of 13 of the US government-funded pieces of research on autism that could show anything. And when you look at those 13 in detail, none of them showed anything that had clinical implications whatsoever. That's the reason they're funding so much research currently, because the previous literature doesn't show anything. When we look in the UK, just very briefly, looking at other medical conditions that take a large chunk of budget, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, stroke, heart disease, we have a sort of additional overall cost per person per annum of about £815, additional cost to the health service of them being there. The amount of research spent in research funding for that group is £14.06 overall. That's about 1.7% of the cost of looking after people with these conditions is spent on research. When we look at ASD, the annual cost per person is £53,073. It's huge in comparison to all of these very debilitating medical conditions. Now, the amount of research money spent per person per annum is 6.5p. So where for the other conditions rolled together, the amount of money as a percentage of spend is 1.7%, for autism it's 0.00012. A tiny fraction of the amount of money that we spend on maintaining people with ASD in the population is spent on research to see how we can get better than starting from having absolutely no idea what we're doing. Does that make sense? So we don't have good evidence on what we would be best to do. We don't spend much on trying to find out, and we continue to spend a huge amount on what we do. So what about motor disruption? Does the MDIA model examine a specific component of ASD, or does it make stronger explanatory claims? Now, you could argue from today either way. We know that there are motor differences in the majority of people with ASD, but we don't know how strong that is as a biological basis that precedes the developments in cognition and language and other aspects of development. Do any claims made have a sound basis in theory? There's quite a lot of neuroanatomical data, functional neuroimaging, etc., that backs up the plausibility of this. Clinically, in a clinical context, does this approach to precision psychiatry make practical sense? If it does, is it affordable? And what are the resource implications? And the question there would be for things like your own research from Rutgers, do we have a strong enough database? Is it different in different populations? We have a large number of Somali autistic children in Glasgow, for example. Are they different from others? I mean, thinking about motor development, head control, for example, if you look at a Somali population, they're precocious compared to Scots. So would the data, normative data be different, and would we be pulling out differences based on something sensible? So is the evidence for movement disruption in ASD convincing? I think it is. Is it necessary? Do we see it in everybody with a diagnosis? I'm not sure. I'm also not sure whether we would see it in other populations that overlap. Would we see it in children with cerebral palsy, in kids with other sorts of motor problems? People have talked about Parkinson's, etc. Sorry.
I think it's absolutely necessary, and at this point, morally responsible to actually put this forward.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is, and I have absolute rigorous evidence for this.
Yeah.
The reason for that is that in the States, these children are being over-medicated by Big Pharma.
Yeah.
The DSM makers are in bed with Big Pharma.
Mm-hmm.
The diagnosis hits under the carpet the sensory motor issues.
Yeah.
And the sensory motor issues are there whether or not you medicate the child. But if you medicate the child, you make those
issues
motor
worse.
issues way worse.
Yeah. And
It's absolutely irresponsible to not quantify, and now we have the biometrics to do it.
yeah.
Do not quantify longitudinally the effects that any kind of drug that you give a kid has on that nervous system. It's a developing nervous system and it's being assaulted.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, Kalevzon, who's working with you, has published quite a lot of work on second order neuroleptics, things like olanzapine, showing abnormal effects in the ASD population. And I think you're right. I think what we need to do is collect the data. I think we're in a situation, if it was a court proceeding, in Scotland we've got guilty, not guilty, and not proven. We're at the not proven stage, which doesn't exist south of the border in England. In Scotland, we don't have enough evidence to make strong claims, but the evidence is suggestive. Yeah? And we need to get better normative data. Now, that's what I'm saying. Is it specific? We're not sure. Is it central? Do we have a theoretical basis that would lead us to suspect it plays a key role? And does the empirical evidence support this view? I think, again, we'd get different perspectives from the different speakers today, but it does seem to have a core role. And if neurodevelopmentally what Jonathan was saying is correct, then the link between olivary nucleus and the central cerebellum and the link to classical conditioning abnormalities and difficulties with insistence on saneness and rigidity all fit together with what you'd expect from the neurobiology. You'd also expect some of the stuff that came from San Diego a few years back, looking at truncal rigidity and the other motor abnormalities that would lead you to motor problems with walking and other aspects of gross motor function. Is it sufficient? Would a movement explanation of ASD be enough? That wouldn't be my opinion, and I remain to be convinced, but it's possible. Did today provide a chance to learn about an interesting research paradigm, or did it show that our current understanding goes further? It's shown us an interesting paradigm. I think we need to flesh it out with more information. And it would be entirely possible, I think, from what I've been hearing, to collect data on a much broader platform in order to validate some of the things that we've been hearing about as research tools from today. Does what we know to date have direct implications for clinical work with people who have an ASD diagnosis? And if so, what are they? Again, I'm not certain. In today's EBP world, evidence-based practice, we need to know whether motor disruption is a core aspect of ASD. If it is, how robust is the evidence and how clinically applicable using the tools and knowledge available to most clinical services? Would it be feasible to do some of the sort of trajectory analyses, etc., in a clinical setting and get data back rapidly that you could use to track response to intervention, for example? Is the use of techniques to track and guide development achievable, affordable, and fit for purpose in real-life contexts? So to draw on earlier speakers, can we use personalised behavioural data analysis to develop precision psychiatry in line with RDoC? Hopefully we can. Just interested, looking back, this is a paper that's about to come out in Autism, red flag markers for early development in the first couple of years of life. And all of the markers that strongly differentiate children with ASD from both children who have other forms of developmental anomaly or from normally developing controls involve a motor component. These are all things that very significantly differentiate all three groups. So interest in objects over people, response to name, reciprocal social play, non-verbal communication, directed eye gaze towards faces, showing and pointing objects to others, and repetitive use of objects are all factors that differentiate significantly between ASD and these two other groups. So all of the discriminating markers involve movement of one type or another. Today we've talked about movement not as a standalone phenomenon, but in interaction with others. We need a novel methodology for clinical assessment of movement in interaction, and we need to validate this in real populations using a methodology that's easily used in a clinical context. We need an accessible methodology to generate applicable approaches to a second-person neuroscience of social functioning that allows us to clarify differences in ASD and look at the effects of intervention. And we're not far off there. We've made huge strides in the last couple of years. I was mentioning at coffee Leonard Schulbach's work on second-order neuroscience, and there's an excellent paper in Behaviour and Brain Sciences on exactly that topic. I gave a reading list for the things I talked about and mentioned the Parkinson's paper, etc. It should be on a chair outside for people to pick up as they go. Last slide. Opportunity dances with those who are already on the dance floor. I think a lot of the people here are already on the dance floor. Whether we've got the right costumes on, I'm not sure. But hopefully by the next meeting we'll have moved significantly further. Things seem to be gathering pace. Thank you.